Aliens displayed a 4D scanner. The human turned it into a camera app. Part 1. First Contact at Veyron Station. The station smelled like something between burnt rubber and cold metal. That was the first thing Junho noticed when he stepped off the shuttle. He adjusted the strap of his bag, looked around at the enormous docking bay, and quietly told himself that he was not going to panic. He was going to try very hard not to panic. Veyron Station was not a human structure. That much was obvious from the first second. The walls curved in directions that did not make complete sense. The lights were not warm or white. They were a pale greenish blue that made everyone look slightly unwell. The ceilings were so high that Junho could not see the top of them clearly, only a kind of dark haze where the lights stopped reaching. The floor was smooth and dark, and it made no sound when people walked on it, which felt wrong in a way that was hard to explain. Junho stood there for a moment, just taking it all in. Behind him, Dayan stepped off the shuttle and immediately bumped into his back because he had stopped without warning. "Move," she said simply. He moved. Dayan was a systems analyst. She had been selected for this trip because she was calm, precise, and excellent at reading situations quickly. She was also very good at telling Junho when he was doing something that was going to cause a problem. She did this often. It was, in her opinion, basically a second full-time job. Junho was a software engineer. He had been selected because he was, according to his file, one of the best in his field. The committee that reviewed his application had noted that he had an unusual way of looking at problems. He tended to simplify things that other people found complicated. His supervisor had added a small note at the bottom of the recommendation letter that said simply, "He will probably try to take something apart. Please prepare for this." The committee had found this charming. Dayan had not found it charming. She had found it accurate. They checked in with the Earth Delegation Coordinator, a tired-looking man named Teho, who had clearly been on the station for several days already, and had the look of someone who had not slept well in all of them. He handed them their room assignments, a schedule of events, and a small printed card that said, at the top, in bold letters, "Please do not touch anything without permission." Junho read the card. He put it in his pocket. Dayan watched him put it in his pocket, and made a mental note to remind him about it later. Long, slow meetings, where representatives from different species introduced themselves through translation devices that worked well enough, but had a slight delay that made every conversation feel a little awkward. Junho sat through all of them. He was polite. He smiled when it seemed like smiling was appropriate. He asked no questions. Dayan found this slightly suspicious, but said nothing. The Galactic Conclave, as it had introduced itself, was a collection of 17 spacefaring species. Some of them had been traveling among the stars for thousands of years. Some had only recently joined. Humans were the newest members, barely 5 years into formal contact, and were generally treated with a kind of patient, slightly amused tolerance, the way an old professor might treat a new student who had just walked into a very advanced class. Humans were aware of this. Most of the Earth delegation had been briefed on it. They were told to be humble, to listen more than they spoke, and to remember that they were guests. Junho understood all of this. He agreed with it completely. He was also already, quietly and without making any fuss about it, paying very close attention to everything around him. The second day was the showcase. This was the main event, the reason the Conclave had invited so many delegations to Veyron Station in the first place. Every few years, the Conclave organized what it called a Technology Sharing Summit. Each species was invited to present one piece of technology to the group. The idea was to encourage cooperation and trust. In practice, most species brought something impressive enough to make a point, but not so impressive that it revealed anything truly sensitive. It was, in other words, a very polite form of showing off. Junho had been looking forward to this. The hall where the showcase took place was enormous. Rows of low benches arranged in a half-circle faced a central display platform. Species clustered together in their groups. The Varathi on one side, tall and insectoid, with dark-plated bodies and eyes that caught the light in a way that made them look constantly alert. The Scythori on the other side, smaller and more compact, their skin a shifting pale gray that changed slightly depending on the light. And a dozen others in between, all different, all watching the platform with varying degrees of interest. The humans sat near the middle. There were 12 of them total. Junho was near the end of the row. Daeon sat next to him. She had her tablet open and was taking notes. Junho had a small notebook, actual paper, which several nearby aliens found mildly confusing, and a pen. The first 3 presentations were interesting but not surprising. A propulsion upgrade, a new kind of atmospheric processing unit, a medical diagnostic system that worked on multiple biology types. Each one was met with polite acknowledgement and a round of what translation devices described as applause, though it sounded different from every species. Then the Varathi took the platform. The Varathi ambassador, a large individual whose name translated roughly as something that sounded like a low hum, moved to the center of the platform without any introduction. Behind him, 2 attendants carried a device roughly the size of a large suitcase. They set it down carefully. One of them touched a panel on the side. The device opened. It was not dramatic in the way that some presentations were dramatic. No flash of light, no loud sound. It simply opened, and from its center rose a soft column of shifting light that filled the space above the platform with what looked at first glance like a slowly rotating model of the hall itself. But it was not just the hall. It was the hall and everyone inside it and the space around them, and somehow the slight movement of time itself, the half-second lag between one moment and the next, rendered visible as a kind of faint shimmer layered over everything. A 4-dimensional spatial scanner, real-time, portable, precise enough to map biological structures at the cellular level, while simultaneously tracking environmental changes across a measurable time window. The room was silent for a long moment. Then came the sounds of appreciation, clicks, hums, a low vibration from the Scythori side, and from the human section, a quiet murmur of genuine amazement. Daeon had stopped typing. She was staring at the display with her mouth slightly open. Junho was staring too. But his expression was not quite amazement. It was something quieter than that. Something more focused. He had already opened his notebook to a fresh page. He was already writing. Aliens displayed a 4D scanner. The human turned it into a camera app. Part 2. The human asks embarrassing questions. The presentation lasted about 20 minutes. The Varathi ambassador spoke through his translation device in a calm, even tone, describing the scanner's range, its precision, its ability to render a full 4-dimensional image of any object or space within a radius of approximately 30 meters. He described years of development. He described the theoretical framework. He used words that the translation device rendered as things like temporal layering and dimensional echo mapping and submolecular positional tracking. The other species listened with great respect. Junho listened with his pen moving constantly. When the ambassador finished, he gestured to the display still rotating above the platform and invited questions. 3 ambassadors asked careful, diplomatic questions about cooperation potential and whether the technology had any applications in shared infrastructure projects. The ambassador answered each one smoothly. Then Junho raised his hand. Daeon saw it happen and felt something drop in her stomach. The ambassador looked at the human section with mild curiosity. His translation device registered the gesture, and he nodded toward Junho, which was apparently the Varathi version of, "Go ahead." Junho stood up. He was not a tall person. He was average height, average build, with the slightly distracted look of someone whose mind was always working on something slightly separate from whatever was happening in front of him. He had a pen behind his ear and his notebook open in one hand. "Thank you," he said. "The scanner is remarkable. I was wondering, what format does the output data render in? Like, is it a proprietary compression structure or something closer to a layered spatial archive?" There was a pause. The ambassador blinked, all four of his eyes doing so in a slow, staggered sequence that was apparently normal for Varathi, but which Junho found mildly fascinating. The translation device hummed for a moment, processing. "The output is rendered through a Varathi native encoding framework," the ambassador said carefully. "It is not based on any external standard." Right, Junho said, nodding, writing something down. "But the emission frequency, the light column, the display output, is that variable or fixed? Like, does it always operate at the same output wavelength, or does it adjust based on the target material?" Another pause, longer this time. Several nearby alien delegates turned to look at the human who was asking technical questions at what was supposed to be a diplomatic event. The Sithori representative leaned slightly toward their neighbor and said something that the translation device, with what seemed like almost embarrassed hesitation, rendered as, "Is this normal for them?" Dion, without looking up from her tablet, typed a response she did not say out loud. "Unfortunately, yes." The ambassador answered. "The emission frequency was," he explained, "adaptive. It shifted based on the density and composition of the material being scanned, which was part of what made the 4D output possible in real time." Junho nodded again, wrote again. "Okay, and the time window rendering, the temporal layer, how wide is it? Like, what's the actual measurable gap between the earliest and latest moment that shows up in a single frame?" This question caused a longer pause than any of the previous ones. The ambassador looked at Junho with an expression that was hard to read across the species gap, but which Dayon privately interpreted as, "I did not expect to be asked this." "Approximately 0.3 of what your species would call a second," the ambassador said, slowly, "per rendered frame." Junho wrote that down, underlined it twice. "One more question," he said. Dayon closed her eyes briefly. "Could I, just for a moment, could I just go up and look at it? Not touch it, just look at it from close up. The display, I mean. Just to get a better sense of the output resolution." The hall was quiet. Teho, the Earth coordinator, had gone completely still, in a way that suggested every muscle in his body was asking the same question. How did we get here? The ambassador was silent for a moment. Then something crossed his face, expression maybe, or what passed for expression among the Varathi, and he made a gesture to his attendants. "You may approach," he said. Junho walked to the platform. What happened next lasted about 4 minutes, and became, in the years that followed, something of a small legend within certain diplomatic circles. Junho stood in front of the scanner display. He looked at it carefully. He tilted his head. He looked at it from the side. He crouched down slightly to look at the base of the light column. He stood back up. He moved around it slowly, in a circle, which the Varathi attendants watched with growing uncertainty. He did not touch it. He did, however, take his phone out of his pocket and very quietly take several photos of the display from different angles, which technically fell within the exact boundary of what had been permitted, since he had only asked to look, and looking was all he was doing, just with a record attached. Then he said, "Thank you," and walked back to his seat. Dayon looked at him. He was already writing in his notebook again. His pen was moving fast. "What did you find?" she said, keeping her voice low. "A lot," he said. "Good a lot, or concerning a lot?" He considered this. "Both," he said. "Mostly good." "That's not reassuring." "It's not supposed to be reassuring," he said, not unkindly. "It's supposed to be accurate." On the platform, the ambassador had resumed his presentation, wrapping up with a few final remarks about the Varathi commitment to shared scientific progress. The display rotated slowly above him, rendering the room in 4 dimensions. Every delegate, every surface, every quiet shift of time, all of it mapped in soft light. Junho looked at the photos on his phone. Then he looked at his notes. Then he looked at the scanner one more time from across the room. His expression was very calm. It was the kind of calm that came not from a lack of thoughts, but from too many thoughts all moving in the same direction at once. He wrote one more line in his notebook. Then he circled it. Dion, who was sitting close enough to see the page without trying, glanced over. The line said, "Output codec almost identical to SLFC4. Check compression table." She did not know what SLFC4 was, but she knew that look on his face. She had seen it twice before. Once before he had rewritten an entire navigation software system in a weekend, and once before he had, on a bet, hacked his own building's elevator to play a specific song every time it reached the 3rd floor. Both times, whatever he had been thinking had turned out to be completely correct. She went back to her notes and quietly began preparing herself for the next several days. Aliens displayed a 4D scanner. The human turned it into a camera app. Part 3. 3 Sleepless Nights. Their room on Veyron Station was small and functional. 2 narrow beds, a desk built into the wall, a small window that looked out on the docking side of the station, where shuttlecraft moved slowly in the dark, like fish in deep water. The lights in the room could be adjusted, but never quite reached the warm yellow that felt normal. They stayed a pale shade of almost white, slightly cool, slightly clinical. Junho did not seem to notice. He was already at the desk before Dion had finished putting her bag down. She watched him set out his notebook, open his tablet, plug in a small external drive he had brought from home, which was technically against the packing guidelines, but which he had brought anyway, and which she had decided not to mention because she had known, even before the trip, that something like this would happen. "You're going to work tonight," she said. It was not a question. "I'm going to think tonight," he said. "The working part will start tomorrow." "What's the difference?" He looked up at her. "The thinking part is quieter." She turned off her lamp and went to sleep. He was still at the desk when she woke up 6 hours later. There were 3 empty cups of the station-provided beverage that was supposedly similar to coffee. It tasted like someone had described coffee to a person who had never had it, and asked them to try their best, which was to say it was warm and slightly bitter, and technically did the job. His notebook had 17 new pages of notes. His tablet was open to a file he had apparently created at some point in the night, full of small blocks of code that she could not read from across the room. She looked at him. He looked tired but bright-eyed, the way he always looked when he was in the middle of something. "You found something," she said. "I found several somethings," he said. He turned the tablet toward her. On the screen was a side-by-side comparison of 2 codec structures, one she didn't recognize, and one she did. "This one on the left is the Vorathi scanner's output structure. I worked it out from the display frequency, the image layering pattern, and the emission timing. This one on the right is SLFC4. She looked at the 2 structures. Even without a deep technical background in codecs, she could see that they were, if not identical, extremely similar in their basic architecture. SLFC4 is a spatial light field codec, Junho said, as if she had asked, which she hadn't, but would have eventually. Humans developed it in the late 2020s for use in holographic display systems. We mostly moved away from it by 2031 because better options came along. But the structure itself, the way it packages spatial data into layers and compresses them for output, it's almost exactly the same as what the Vorathi scanner uses. The Vorathi version handles an extra dimension, the time layer, but it does it by adding a second compression pass on top of the base spatial data. He paused. "Which means," he said, "that if I write a translation layer, something that reads the Vorathi output, and converts that extra temporal pass into a format a standard device can read, then theoretically, any standard device could read and display 4D scanner beta. Diane sat down slowly on the edge of her bed. Without needing the scanner, she said. Well, you'd still need a source for the data. But yes, without needing the scanner's proprietary display system. Any device running the translation layer would be able to take the raw output from the scanner and render it into something displayable. She started. Yeah, he said. The Varathi spent probably decades developing that scanner. I know. And you're saying you can write a wrapper app that does the display work. Not the scanning work, he said. Just the display. The scanner still does the hard part. I'm just making the output readable on any device. In how long? He considered this, looking at his notes. The translation layer itself, maybe a day. Getting it clean and stable, another day. Testing it against the photos I took, another day after that. He paused. If I don't sleep. She looked at him for a long moment. I'll get you more of the coffee thing, she said. She did not approve, exactly. But she was also practical. And she knew that telling Junho to stop, when he was in the middle of something, was roughly as effective as telling a river to stop being wet. The next 2 days followed a pattern. Junho worked. Diane attended the summit sessions that they were both technically required to attend, signed them both in, took notes for both of them, and brought food back to the room at regular intervals. She also checked in on Junho every few hours, not to monitor him exactly, but because she had worked with him long enough to know that when he got deep into something, he sometimes forgot that he was a person who needed water. He was not difficult to take care of in the end. He ate what she brought. He even slept for about 5 hours on the second night, which she considered a reasonable success. On the third day, something changed. She came back from the morning session to find him sitting back in his chair, not hunched forward over the desk, but actually sitting back, which was unusual. He was looking at his tablet with a calm expression that was different from the focused, slightly tense look of the previous days. This was quieter, settled. Done, she said. Done, he said. She sat down. He turned the tablet toward her. On the screen was a simple interface, very simple, almost plain. A large circular button in the center, a small settings icon in the corner, a thin slider along one edge. It looked like a camera app. A very clean, very minimal camera app. That's it, she said. You point a device running this app at any active output from the Varathi scanner, or anything using a compatible spatial codec, which is actually a few other species systems too, as it turns out, and it renders the full 4D image on any standard screen, time layer included. It auto-adjusts the temporal window to fit the screen's refresh rate so it doesn't look weird. She stared at the interface for a moment. You added a slider. That adjusts the temporal depth, how much of the time window you want visible in the frame. I set the default to about 0.2 seconds, because 0.3 was slightly too much. Things looked blurry. She stared at him. I also added 3 display modes, he said. Standard, which looks like a regular image. Structural, which highlights internal composition, good for material analysis. And one I'm calling Portrait, which softens the time layer and prioritizes surface resolution. You added a portrait mode, she said slowly, to an app that reads 4-dimensional alien scanner data. It makes the output look nicer, he said simply. People are going to use it for photos. There was a long silence in the small room. Outside the narrow window, a shuttle was docking, its running lights blinking slow and steady in the dark. Dayon pressed her fingers to her forehead. What's the file called? She finally asked. He showed her the screen. At the top of the app interface, in small, clean letters, it said, Snap. She laughed. She couldn't help it. It came out before she could stop it. A short, tired, genuine laugh that she immediately covered with her hand. Junho smiled, just slightly. Get some sleep, she told him. The next session is tomorrow morning. and you are going to need to be awake for it. He closed the tablet. He actually went to bed this time. Within about 4 minutes, he was asleep. Diane sat at the desk for a little while longer. She looked at the tablet screen, dark now, reflecting the pale station light. 3 days, 72 hours roughly, and a codec comparison, a translation layer, and a portrait mode. She shook her head once, quietly, to herself. Aliens displayed a 4D scanner. The human turned it into a camera app. Part 4. The demo that broke the conclave. The 4th day of the summit was supposed to be a discussion session. A round-table format, every delegation seated together in a large circular hall. A series of topics on the agenda, mostly about resource-sharing protocols and proposed joint research frameworks. It was, by the schedule's own description, a session for careful, measured diplomatic conversation. Nobody expected anything unusual to happen. Tejo had given the Earth delegation a brief reminder that morning, over a shared breakfast, of something the station served that was trying very hard to approximate eggs. He told them to be engaged, but not too enthusiastic. He told them to ask questions, but not too many. He looked briefly and specifically at Junho when he said this last part, and Junho nodded in what appeared to be an honest and reassuring way. Diane ate her food and said nothing. The session began smoothly. The Sci-Story delegation opened with a proposal about atmospheric data sharing between 3 star systems. The Varathi responded with a counter-proposal about transit rights. There were several rounds of polite back and forth that moved slowly and carefully, as these things always did, which was fine and appropriate and entirely expected. Junho sat in his chair. He was not taking notes. He had his tablet in his bag. His hands were folded in his lap. He looked, to anyone watching him, like a person who was paying attention in a calm and cooperative manner. Diane, sitting next to him, knew better. She could tell by the very slight angle of his jaw, a kind of contained energy, a readiness, that he was waiting for something. She did not know exactly what he was planning. She had not asked. Part of her had decided it was better not to know in advance, because knowing in advance would have created a situation where she would have had to decide whether to stop him, and she was honestly not sure she would have been able to. The moment came about 40 minutes into the session. The Varathi ambassador, the same one who had presented the scanner 2 days earlier, made a passing remark during a discussion about sensor technology in joint research projects. He said, not unkindly, that certain more recently admitted species might benefit from familiarizing themselves with existing advanced systems before proposing new cooperative frameworks. He did not say humans specifically. He did not need to. Several delegates glanced toward the Earth section. It was a small moment, the kind of thing that could be interpreted multiple ways. Junho raised his hand. The session moderator, a tall Sithori with a calm, unhurried manner, acknowledged him. Junho stood up. He reached into his bag. He took out his tablet. He said, very politely and clearly, "I'd like to do a quick demonstration, if that's all right." There was a pause. The moderator looked around the table. No one objected, though several looked uncertain about what exactly they were agreeing to. "Go ahead," the moderator said. Junho turned to the Varathi ambassador. "Ambassador, the scanner from your presentation the other day, is it still on the station? Still active?" The ambassador looked at him steadily. "It is in the adjoining technical bay. It is in standby mode." "Would you be willing to have it activated briefly? Just the output display in this room? You don't have to move it. If the output can reach this hall from the bay, that would be enough." The ambassador considered this for a moment. Then he made a small gesture to one of his attendants near the back of the room. The attendant moved quietly toward the door. There was a short wait of about 2 minutes. Then the familiar soft light appeared, faint, filtering in through the open doorway at the side of the hall. the 4D display casting its pale shifting glow into the space. It was not as strong as it had been in the showcase hall, but it was there, visible, the temporal shimmer layering over the shapes of the delegates closest to the door. Junho looked at the display through the doorway. He raised his tablet. He tapped the screen once. The app opened. Clean interface, circular button, small slider on the side. He pointed the tablet toward the doorway where the scanner's output light was filtering in. He pressed the button. The tablet's screen filled with a full, clear, rendered image. Not a photograph, not a regular image, a complete 4D render of the section of the room nearest the doorway. 3 delegates rendered in perfect spatial detail, their internal structures faintly visible. And layered over it all, clear as anything, the temporal shimmer. The 0.2-second window of time, rendered smooth and readable on a standard screen. He turned the tablet around so the room could see it. The silence that followed was not the polite silence of diplomatic patience. It was the silence of an entire room of beings trying to process something that did not fit neatly into their existing understanding. Rael, the Sithori ambassador, a composed individual who had in 30 years of diplomatic work seen many surprising things, stared at the tablet, then at the tablet again. That device, Rael said carefully, is displaying a full 4-dimensional render. Yes, Junho said, from the scanner output. From the scanner output, yes. My device is just doing the display work. The scanner is still doing the scanning. I just wrote a translation layer so that the output can be read by any standard device. How long did this take you? Junho considered. 3 days, he said, roughly. The Vorathi ambassador, who had been very still since the moment the tablet screen had lit up, spoke. His voice through the translation device was measured, but there was something underneath it. Not anger, not quite. Something more complex than that. How did you access the output encoding structure of our scanner? I observed it, Junho said simply, from the display during your presentation. The emission frequency, the layer timing, the render pattern. It gave me enough to work out the basic structure. I compared it to some older human codec work and found a strong structural similarity. From there, it was mostly just writing the translation. Another silence. You did this by observation, the ambassador said slowly. Without physical access to the device. Without documentation. I took some photos of the display output from close range, Junho said. That helped with the resolution analysis. Teiho, at the far end of the Earth delegation table, appeared to be breathing very carefully and deliberately, the way a person might breathe when they are trying to stay calm and are finding it somewhat difficult. Daeyeon, sitting beside Junho, had her tablet open. She was, on the surface, taking notes. In reality, she was watching the room with sharp, careful attention, reading every expression and posture and small shift she could detect across 17 alien species, running a quiet, internal calculation about how this was going to land. It was landing, she thought, in a complicated way. The Vorathi ambassador was not pleased. That was clear. But he was also, she thought, something else. Something that looked, across the species gap, remarkably like a kind of reluctant and deeply unwilling respect. Rael of the Sithori stood up fully. This was apparently a significant gesture among the Sithori. Standing fully during a seated session meant something. Several delegates turned to look. I would like to see this application, Rael said. The full interface. Junho walked the tablet over to the ambassador and handed it across the table without hesitation. Rael looked at the screen, tapped the slider, watched the temporal depth shift in the display, found the settings menu, looked at the 3 display modes, standard, structural, portrait. Looked at the portrait mode label for a moment. Portrait, Rael said. It softens the time layer, Junho said. Better for close-range imaging of people. The standard mode can look a little, he paused, harsh. Rael looked at him. You added an aesthetic mode, Rael said, to a four-dimensional sensor interface. "People are going to use it to take photos," Junho said, in a tone that suggested this was obvious. It seemed practical. The tablet passed around the table, slowly, carefully, each delegate looking at it, turning it, looking at the display, looking at Junho. Near the back of the room, quietly, an aide to one of the smaller delegations leaned toward their colleague and said something in their own language. The translation device on the table nearby rendered it, faintly as, "I want this on my device." Aliens displayed a 4D scanner. The human turned it into a camera app. Part 5. What the Galaxy Learned About Humans. The session did not continue as scheduled. It was not that anyone called it off. No one officially suspended the agenda or declared the meeting over. It was more that, after Junho's tablet made its quiet journey around the table and returned to his hands, the conversation that followed bore very little resemblance to the resource-sharing discussion that had been planned. The moderator, to their credit, made 2 attempts to redirect to the agenda. Neither attempt worked. The room had shifted in a way that made returning to atmospheric data protocols feel slightly beside the point. By the time the session formally ended, 2 hours later than scheduled, 3 things had happened. The Varathi ambassador had lodged a formal inquiry with the Conclave's administrative office. Not a complaint exactly. He had been careful about that. An inquiry requesting clarification on the intellectual property protocols surrounding technology demonstrated at summit events. It was a reasonable and legitimate inquiry. It was also, in Dion's reading of the situation, the Varathi trying to work out what exactly they were dealing with, and what, if anything, could be done about it. Rael of the Sci-Fi had requested a private meeting with the Earth delegation, not a formal diplomatic session, just a meeting. The request was made through Teho, who had accepted it in a calm and professional manner, and then gone somewhere private for approximately 10 minutes, before returning with the expression of a man who had gathered himself back together through sheer willpower. And 4 aides from different delegations had, separately and without coordinating with each other, quietly asked Junho, in corridors, near doorways, with the slightly careful manner of people doing something they weren't certain was appropriate, whether the application was available for download. Junho had said each time that he would think about it. The private meeting with Rael took place that evening in a small conference room off the main corridor. The Earth side was Teho, Dion, and Junho. Rael brought 2 aides. They sat across from each other at a small table, and Rael, who had the kind of direct manner that Dion privately found very easy to respect, said almost immediately that she wanted to understand what had happened. Not the technical part, she said. She understood the technical part. What she wanted to understand was the thinking behind it. Junho considered the question for a moment in the way he always considered questions, fully, without rushing. "The scanner was remarkable," he said. "The technology behind it is clearly very advanced. But the output display, the way the data gets shown, that part was essentially a solved problem. Humans had built something structurally similar years ago, for completely different purposes. We just didn't know the Varathi had arrived at a similar solution from a different direction. When I saw the display, the structure of it was familiar enough that the translation work was straightforward." "And you saw this," Rael said, "in a 20-minute presentation." "I was paying attention," Junho said. There was nothing boastful in how he said it. It was simply a statement of fact. Rael was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Most species, when they see technology that is beyond their current level, respond with admiration, or with a desire to acquire it through negotiation, or with an attempt to replicate it over time. You responded by making it interoperable." Junho thought about this. "I suppose that's right," he said. "Why?" He seemed genuinely uncertain how to answer, not because he didn't have an answer, but because the answer felt obvious to him, and he was trying to understand why it needed explanation. Because it was useful, he said finally, and it didn't need to be complicated. Rael looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Dion. Is this characteristic, she asked, of humans generally? Dion chose her words with care. It's characteristic of some humans, she said. The ones who look at a problem and immediately start thinking about what it's made of, and whether any of those pieces can be used for something else. And this one? Rael asked, meaning Junho. He's one of the worst cases, Dion said, in the sense that there's no filter between the observation and the doing. He sees something, he understands it, and he builds something with it. The gap between those 3 steps is very short for him. Junho, to his credit, did not appear bothered by this description. He seemed, if anything, to find it accurate and unremarkable. What was discussed went into the official record eventually, but the short version was that Rael was interested, genuinely, practically interested, in the application, in its broader potential, and in the question of what other existing human-developed systems might interface in unexpected ways with technology currently in use among conclave species. She was not the only one, she indicated. Others had been watching the session that afternoon with more attention than had been visible. The Varathi inquiry, meanwhile, worked its way through the conclave's administrative review process over the following 2 days. The outcome was, in the end, relatively simple. Junho had observed a public demonstration. He had written original code. The translation layer was his own work. The application did not replicate the scanner. It did not scan anything. It only processed an output signal that the Varathi had themselves chosen to broadcast into a shared public space during a summit presentation. The inquiry was resolved without formal action. The Varathi ambassador, when informed of this resolution, said nothing for a long time. Then he said, through his translation device, that he would be recommending to his government that future summit presentations include stricter signal containment protocols. It was, in Dion's opinion, a very reasonable recommendation. She wrote it in her notes without comment. The last 2 days of the summit passed more quietly, at least on the surface. Underneath, she could feel the shift. The way delegations moved differently around the Earth section. Less of the patient, slightly amused tolerance of earlier in the week. Something more careful, more attentive. Not hostile, nothing like that. Just a recalibration, a quiet adjustment of expectations. On the second-to-last evening, Junho uploaded a clean build of Snap to the station's shared open-access network. He did it without making any announcement. He just posted it, with a short text description of what it did, and a note that it was free to use and modify, and went to get something to eat. By the next morning, it had been downloaded 43 times, by devices registered to 11 different species. 2 of those species had, within the day, identified that their own sensor output systems used a codec structure similar enough to the Varathi standard that Snap could be adapted for their devices with minor modification. One of them had already begun that modification. They sent Junho a message through the station's communication network, asking if he would be willing to share the source code. He had replied within about 4 minutes. Let me know if you have questions about the translation layer. It's a bit specific in places. Dion read the message exchange over his shoulder and said nothing. She had to admit, not surprised. The shuttle home was quieter than the shuttle out had been. Tejo slept for most of the flight. Several other delegation members read, or worked, or stared out the small windows at the dark, between stars. Junho had his notebook out again. He was filling pages. "What are you working on now?" Dion asked. She asked it the way someone asks a question when they're not entirely sure they want to know the answer. "I was thinking," he said, not looking up, "about the Sci-Fi quantum resonance drive. Rael mentioned it briefly in the meeting. The way she described the output cycle, the timing structure of it, there's something familiar about it. I can't place it exactly yet." Dion looked at the ceiling of the shuttle for a moment. We've been on this shuttle for 4 hours, she said. I know, he said. You could sleep. I could, he agreed. He did not stop writing. She looked out the window. The stars were very far away and very still. Somewhere out there, on 43 devices belonging to 11 different species, a small app called Snap was sitting in a folder, ready to use. Some of those devices had already used it. Some would share it further. Some would modify it and share those modifications. The code would move through the network the way ideas moved, quietly, quickly, finding the spaces where they fit. Back on Earth, a brief report from the summit had already reached 3 universities and a small technology firm that had a long-standing interest in codec interoperability. The report included a link to the application. All 3 universities had opened it within an hour of receiving it. The galaxy was large and very old, and most of the species in it had spent a long time learning to be careful with what they showed and what they shared. They had learned, over many years, that technology was power, and power was not given freely. They had not, it turned out, spent enough time thinking about what happened when a species showed up that was not primarily interested in acquiring technology, that was interested instead in understanding it, simplifying it, making it work on anything, and putting it on a shared network for free, with a note that said, "Let me know if you have questions." Junho filled another page. Outside the window, the stars moved slowly past as the shuttle carried them home, and the galaxy, quietly and without fully realizing it yet, began to adjust. The official Conclave advisory, filed 6 months later, Earth File 0047, included a single line in its summary section that was not strictly required by the reporting format, but which the filing officer had added anyway, because it seemed accurate. Do not show them anything you are not prepared for them to improve.